last time I gave it was in Stillorgan a week and a half ago, and 92 people turned up, and 26 of them have booked in for a 3-day trip to Killarney in September, where we're going to walk all the different features that appear here. From time to time in history, either side royalty or for royalty or against royalty or whatever, events occur which have a major impact on the country. I would, for example, the first Eucharistic Congress, the president, the visitor president Kennedy, the Pope, the Queen, and whatever you think about them, they're events, and they have a huge impact on the country. And this was one of those events which was huge at the time, long forgotten now by most people, but we just revisited. There's Killarney in 1860, pretty grim place. You're only talking about, 12, 13 years after the famine. So, things were pretty grim. There were two big estates. There was the Earls of Kenmare, and there was the Herberts in Mucker's house. The Kenmare estate was notable for a number of cottage ornée, and there's one of them, and we'll see others. This, incidentally, is the original Kate Carney's cottage. See the few little bottles there? And they were usually travellers with, rich travellers who were perhaps, poor people have no way of getting to Killarney, what they know about Killarney, and there's the Gap of Dunlow there. So, Queen Victoria decided she wanted to visit Killarney. And one of the questions is, what the hell she wants to go to Killarney for, because that's a huge journey. And the answer is in the current edition of History Ireland, which is a bi-monthly magazine, as you know, the January, February, March, and talks about the College Lawn and tourism in Killarney. There was an event happened in the early 1800s at the Shannon Estuary, where a girl, Ellie Hanley, she was a local girl, 15, peasant girl really, and there was the son of a local landowner, John Scanlon. This Ellie was remarkable beauty, and Scanlon took a shine to her, and he worked on her. And he and Ellie eloped, and he organised a sham marriage because she was Catholic and there was no way she was going to have to do with him if she wasn't married. And he kind of deluded her in the fact that she was going to go up in the world, and not only did she elope with him, but she nicked all the family savings and gave it to him as well. And he put her up in a cottage secretly because he said it would take some time for him to break it to his family and get them to accept it. But he used to visit her, if not every night, then regularly in the cottage. But after about 6 weeks, when he'd had his way with Ellie, he realised he'd made a mistake. And he had a sidekick who kind of looked up to him, Sullivan, and he decided that the only way out of this, because he wouldn't be marriageable qualities if people knew about Ellie, and he was going to marry up. So he arranged with this Sullivan guy that they would get rid of Ellie. And Sullivan took her out on the Shannon Estuary and attacked her and drowned her and so on. Now, some years later, the author Gerald Griffin wrote a novel based on that story. But the Shannon Estuary wasn't romantic enough. So he transferred the whole thing to Killarney. And the place where your man put her up, he chose Dinah's cottage, which is a real cottage, bricky and bridge, and he called her in the book the Colleen Bawn. Okay, so he wrote the book. Now, then Dion Boucicault took the same story and turned it into a play. And the play was The Lily of Killarney. But he used all the characters from the book, and he also used Killarney as the venue. Although Killarney had nothing whatever got to do with the story. And he decided that your man Sullivan got her onto this little island and threw her off the rock there, and that became known as the Colleen Bawn Rock. Now that play was a big hit in London, and Queen Victoria, who was a young woman, not the old git we got to know later, a young vibrant woman, she was very taken by the play, and she went 3 times to the play. And one of the features of the play was huge backdrop at the back of the stage, made up of big portraits, panoramas of the lakes of Killarney. And she was so taken by these that she got an artist to do 6 paintings of these backdrops, about this size, which are still in the Royal Collection in Windsor. So she had this fascination about Killarney, all from going to this play, Dion Boucicault. Now, years later, when she was dead, 1911, there was also a film made of it, a black and white film. I don't know whether it still exists or not. So that's the background to the visit. She had this thing that she went to this play 3 times, and she wanted to see Killarney. Now, there's her wedding. She became queen at 18 years of age. She married her first cousin when she was 21, and she had been queen for 3 years at that time. It was a love marriage, which was unusual in those days, and they were absolutely physically devoted to each other, such that they had 9 children. Contraception didn't exist at the time. So there she is at 41 years of age with 9 children. She couldn't stand children. The children was the result of the physical relation between herself and Albert. And there being no contraception in those days, they couldn't stop them coming. And after the 9th one, her doctor advised her that it wouldn't be advisable to having any more. And she said that was out of the question, they just couldn't keep their hands off each other. So they were absolutely, totally devoted to each other. And she relied heavily on him for his judgment and so on. Now, he was German, and they gave their children an awful time. You get a book in the library called Bertie about the son. They gave them an awful time. They knew nothing about bringing up children. They left her all up to nannies, except that they set all these rules and regulations. Now, Bertie, the eldest fella, and that's Bertie there, who later became Edward VII. They put terrible restrictions on Bertie. And of course, if you put over restrictions on a child, the first chance they get, they break out, you know what I mean? And Albert decided that Bertie needed to be smartened up a bit. He realised that he wouldn't be up to a military career, but maybe 16 weeks in the army wouldn't do him any harm, just strengthen him up. It wouldn't do to have it in England because he'd be visible and so on. So they decided that this would happen in Ireland, in the Curragh. And they sent Bertie to the Curragh to get 16 weeks. Now, Bertie was going to pass out in the Curragh. You know where they all, at the end, like Garda passing out and so on. And they came over to see Bertie passing out. Big event for them. And she decided that they would throw in a holiday to Killarney while they were at it, because this was an opportunity to finally see Killarney. Albert was a very modern man. She adored Albert. He was there for the foundation of the railways. He got rid of the old royal yacht, the sailing thing, and he put in the first motorised yacht, called it Victorian Albert, and there it is arriving, coming into Dunleary. She was dressed in black. She was in great form, but she was dressed in black, as was he, and she had 3 of the children with her, Alfred and 2 of the daughters, and that was solely because her mother had just died, and they were big into mourning in those days. So 6 months black was called for. Although normally she'd be dressed very vibrantly as a young woman, she was all activity, all attention, very vibrant, and there were a couple that, you know, clicked well together. Little did she know that although she was wearing black for her mother's death, that she'd be wearing black for the rest of her life. But we'll come to that in a moment. They stayed in the Viceregal Lodge, and on the second day, Albert visited the newly refurbished Kildare Street Club, which you're all aware of there in Kildare Street, and he also had a look at the nearly finished Wellington Monument. The Wellington Monument was never finished. Until recent years, it actually remained the tallest obelisk in the world. I think the Washington one has surpassed it. But originally there was to be a statue of Wellington, see there? But the money ran out. So but he viewed that. And then off down to the Curragh to see Bertie in the passing out. Now Bertie was to be in this position here, the head of a kind of a detachment of soldiers. But he was bloody useless, like, he was absolutely bloody useless. He had no interest in it. So in fact, the commands are being called out by one of the officers behind him, because Bertie couldn't master it at all, but she thought it was absolutely marvellous. It was marvellous. And there's the Dublin Mountains, this the Curragh. So it's a big thing, like the horse guard trooping the guard, the thing they do every year. The British are into all that. It's all nonsense, of course, but they're into all that. I just go back and point out something. What she didn't know was in the 16 weeks he was there, first time he was ever got free of anything. His fellow cadets thought he could do as a bit of education. And they used to creep out at night with him and go into Dublin, where he would visit the music halls and so on, where he met a lady called Nellie Clifton. And he took a great shine to Nellie. This is the first time he was let outside the door. And Nellie took a bigger shine to him. And Nellie introduced him to the ways of the world and made a man of him. And he had a marvellous time. And there he is at that time. He was only 18 years of age. Now, Albert and Victoria were probably aware of that because the Secret Service were there to watch Bertie. They wouldn't have approved, of course. No way would they have approved. But they felt, well, look, if it has to happen, let it happen in Ireland in the back of beyond, and it's forgotten, and you come back here. So they were going on to Killarney. He joined them. The railway had just reached Killarney 3 years before, and the first rail coach was made. And that's a drawing of the Royal Rail Coach. And you see it's not that long, and the reason for that is that the bogie wheel hadn't been invented. Now the bogie wheels were wheels under the carriage that twisted when you went around the corner. You know what I mean? As the carriage goes around the corner, you'd even see it on the Lewis, the bogie twists. They hadn't invented that, so that restricted the length of carriages for going around bends. You understand me? But there it is, the Royal Coach. Now, she loved the railways. She used to travel to Balmoral and so on, but the railways were a new invention, and she had grown up in the era of carriages, horse carriages, so this was a huge change. But she was terrified of the speed, absolutely terrified, and she would not allow it to go more than 40 miles an hour, and she felt that she couldn't dine with dignity on a moving rail carriage. So the whole bloody thing had to stop for lunch, usually beside the station where she could use the facilities and so on, with the result that it took 7 hours to go from Dublin to Killarney. Now, they were going to stay in two places. One was Kenmare House, which was the home of the Earls of Kenmare, and then they were going, that was the official visit, and then they were going on to a private visit to Muckross, the Herberts. Now the reason for that is that Muckross was the location of Boucicault's play, the Colleen Bawn. All the locations were around Muckross, all the names of the play and in the book and so on. In fact, the tragedy didn't happen there at all, it happened up in the Shannon estuary. But she wanted to see all the locations and so on. There they are arriving at Muckross House, the Earl of Kenmare. Now, what you have to understand, and we're going to do a lot of tragedy later, is because of how these people got the land. I mean, the Earl of Kenmare had 120,000 acres, and the Herberts had 47,000 acres. Royal grants and so on. Now, therefore, a visit by the monarch was a great honour, and the financial kiss of death. The cost of hosting all this was unbelievable. The whole place had to be done up. The Earl of Kenmare, I'll show you now, one of the big things that was staying in the Earl of Kenmare was the boat trip on the lakes. And she initiated what is still today the premier tourist thing in Killarney, and that's the boat trip from the upper lakes all the way down. And she initiated that. And there she is arriving at Ross Castle for the boat trip, and there were about 200 other boats there to accompany the flotilla. Now, do you see this royal barge? The Earl of Kenmare had that made in London and transported to Killarney. Now, the cost of that in 1861, the royal barge. And there's Ross Castle, and there they are leaving on the trip up the lakes. And there they are going up the lakes with all this flotilla of people behind them. And the first place they stopped was Glenna Cottage, which was one of the cottage ornée on the Kenmare. The cottage ornée is a fairy tale cottage, and there were loads of them on the Kenmare estate. And they stopped there for déjeuner. Now, déjeuner is like lunch to you and me, or the snack. And they stopped there at Glenna Cottage. And photography at that stage, all they could photograph was still. See, you stand like this and stay like that, and they could photograph. They couldn't photograph moving stuff at that stage. So the London Illustrated News did its drawings. I often marvel at the artists from the papers that you could draw these things so quickly, you know. And there's one, and there's from another newspaper, Glenna Cottage, and she had light lunch there. And there's the real Glenna Cottage. Lovely, isn't it? Yeah. Beautiful. We'll see more of them later, and there's the side of it down there. So after lunch, away they went again, up to the upper lake and the Eagle Coast, and on up towards the top of the upper lake, and they stopped for afternoon tea at Derrycunny. Now there wasn't a house big enough to receive them there. Derrycunny had a famous waterfall. See the waterfall? And they had afternoon tea at the foot of the waterfall. Now there's another little cottage ornée, but it's very small, at Derrycunny. You see it there? And look at your man. Grand little job there now, sitting on the rock, minding the place. There's a cartoon from one of the papers of the press boat ran aground. And there was fierce panic, apparently. And you can see the military escort, there's a whole thing. But now, her ladies in waiting and the ladies of the Kenmare house and the Herbert house and so on, they were brought up in carriages to a viewpoint where they could see the royal flotilla coming up the lakes. And to this day, that's known as Ladies' View. That's how it got the name, Ladies' View. She wasn't a bad little artist. She kept a scrapbook, and if you go to Windsor, her scrapbooks are there and so on. But on the first evening there, she drew a little sketch of Killarney. No, she wasn't, but it's not bad, you know, it's not there. And she was 42 years of age when she did that. Now there's a sample of the cottages on the Kenmare estate. They're lovely. Now there's only two of them still exist. Dina Cottage, this one here, which is at the gate lodge into the Kenmare estate, and it's spelled Dinas, but the locals call it Dinas Cottage. Now that was there at the time, and when Gerald Griffin wrote the novel, he gave that as the location where Scanlon put Ellie Handy. And nearby was Bricky and Bridge, and they're all still there. And we'll come back to that later in the Queen's visit. These three are gone, and I'll come to that later. So that was the first full day, and then they had a full meal that night and a formal dinner and so on. And then the next day they were off to Muckra's house. Now, as I said, it was only 12, 13 years since the famine, so this was quite a risky thing to be doing. She wasn't popular, and they had drafted in 500 RIC men from all over the country, and they were camped all around Killarney. So the whole place was in lockdown. And then in terms of moving from place to place, she had the full household cavalry, about 60 cavalry, all the stuff and so on. So I mean, the effect on a town like Killarney must have been mind-boggling, you know, to come in. And in the parade, every titled person in Munster had to turn up and be in the parade and through the town. The Earl of Kenmare built 4 huge stands through the town of Killarney. And although we pride ourselves as being fierce Republican, again and again, whether it's the Queen, Prince Charles, Diana, we turn out in our thousands, you know what I mean? And they all turned out, they all did. In fact, nothing untoward happened. So this was our big thing. She wanted to get to Muckra's, she wanted to see the whole thing of the Colleen Bawn and so on. And the Herberts, now they were lesser than the Earls of Kenmare. They didn't have a title. He was Chief Secretary for Ireland, the head of the civil service, and his office would have been where the American ambassador now lives in the Phoenix Park. But this was his residence, and at that time they had 47,000 acres, they had 85 rooms in the house, so the whole house had to be done top to bottom, new avenues had to be put in, and because she wanted to see all the sites of the Colleen Bawn, a whole new roadway system had to be put in, and we'll come to that later. This is from the visitor's book in Muckra's house, you can still see that today. Albert Edward, that's Bertie, Alice the daughter, Alfred the son, and her entourage there. If you go to visit Muckra's house today, her bedroom is as she left it, and her drawing room and the dining room is as it was when she was there. Muckra's, as you know, is one of the premier visitor locations. Now, the next day was her big day, and Albert went off with the Kenmare's and others hunting stags. She wasn't into all that. And herself and Mrs. Herbert did a drive around, visiting all the places mentioned in the Colleen Bawn. The Colleen Bawn Rock is there, Brickeen Bridge is there, Dinah's Cottage, the meeting of the waters, and so on. And she said, if I can say, we were enchanted by the beauty of the scenery. It was one of the finest drives I have ever taken. And today, along with the trip down the lakes and the boats, this is one of the great tourist things, to walk or cycle what's called the Queen's Drive. It takes an hour to walk from Muckra's house out to Dinah's Cottage, where there's a cafe, and from Dinah's Cottage back is about another 50 minutes. The Queen had afternoon tea in Dinah's Cottage, because that was the location where your man Scanlon was supposed to have put Ellie. Of course, it's all, the story is true, but the locations are fictitious, because it actually happened somewhere else. But she had afternoon tea with Mrs. Herbert in Dinah's Cottage. So if you're ever down there, you can go out and have afternoon tea where Queen Victoria had the afternoon tea. But she had a marvellous time, really enjoyed it. Now, there's a painting of Prince Albert and the stag hunt there. She wasn't interested in that. Now, the final night there, Mrs. Herbert was quite a well-known and accomplished artist. And at the final dinner, the final night, Mrs. Herbert gave her 3 of her paintings. She was a fine artist. Tork Waterfall, Tork Bridge, and Muckra's Abbey. Now, when our own president visited Buckingham, they put on a display of Irish stuff, and included in the display was the 3 paintings from Mrs. Herbert, and also the paintings of the Boucicault backdrops. You know, I told you from she got paintings made. The Queen, she really liked these, and they're still there, but she remarked to Mrs. Herbert that she hadn't seen Muckra's Abbey. And Mrs. Herbert said to her, well, it's only down about 800, 900 yards down. And although they were leaving the following morning, she asked would Mrs. Herbert bring her down to see Muckra's Abbey. And the 2 of them got into a pony and trap, and on the morning of 29th of August, while everyone else was packing up ready to go, herself and Mrs. Herbert went down and walked around Muckra's Abbey. It is a ruin, but it is probably the most intact ruin of the churches that were destroyed in the Reformation. It still has its full cloister, it has its upstairs and downstairs intact. Some of the roof is intact, and what's reputed to be the oldest yew tree in Ireland is in the cloister. Lovely spot to visit. And then they were off, back home, Dunleary, onto the yacht and home. Now, almost of more interest is what happened after that. Woeful situation. So we start with Victoria and Albert. She was a diarist, she kept a diary. And she said, Killarney is indescribably beautiful and exceeded my highest expectations. I've never seen such diversified and strikingly contrasted scenery. No verbal description can do justice to the lakes. Albert wasn't a man of much word, but he said Killarney is a fairyland. And she never stopped talking about it, and she never stopped urging people to go and see Killarney. And because of the whole thing of the Colleen Bawn and the trips on the thing, she started a whole trend. And people came from all over to see Killarney. There they are, at round about the age at that time, 42, a very devoted couple. Now here's an interesting little thing. Albert, he didn't like living in Buckingham Palace. He thought it was too palatial and too cold, and that it wasn't suitable for family living. So Albert built this country house, which would be more suitable for a family, Osborne. And that's where they lived, on the Isle of Wight. Now that's still there, it's under the British Heritage Trust. The royal family don't use it anymore. But this was supposed to be ordinary living, this, you know, as distinct from Buckingham Palace. So here they are down in Osborne House, they've come back. Bertie has been sent to Cambridge, and all is well. And then they get word, about 10 weeks after they get back, that Bertie has brought Nellie Clifton back to Cambridge. And he has set her up in a house in Cambridge, and they're more or less living with each other, and people are starting to talk. And you can imagine the reaction. Christ, you know, he's lost it altogether. Albert had a cold, and he was a bit under the weather, but he was so furious he set off immediately. Now, travel in those days, you know, difficult. So. And on the way, he got the Secret Service and so on, and Nellie was disappeared, gone. And then he tackled Bertie. Because he didn't want any public notice about it, he decided they would go for a long walk. They went for a walk. Bertie thought he knew the way, but they got lost. And the heavens opened, and they both got drenched, but Albert, who had this cold, got drenched. Anyway, he laid into Bertie, and at the end of it, he wouldn't stay, he wouldn't go into the house, he wouldn't do nothing, he was furious. He got in the carriage, headed back to Osborne, took to his bed, and 10 days later he was dead. 42 years of age. Victoria never got over it. She blamed Bertie for the death of his father, and for the rest of her life she blamed him. And she said, I never can nor shall look at him without a shudder. And she never gave him anything to do. She considered him totally unfit to be the monarch. And of course that suited him grand, because the Prince of Wales is a very rich person in his own right, because he's a Duke of Cornwall and the Duchy of Cornwall, so he has a load of income of his own right. So the mother didn't want him about, that was good. And he became one of the great rakes, you know. You couldn't have a newspaper long enough to write down all the women down this way. And she just despised him. She built a huge mausoleum for Albert in Frogmore, a huge thing. And she was so convinced that she couldn't live without him and she would die, that when she got the stone effigies made, she got one made for herself. Now, of course, she lived for another 40 years. And when she did die, they had to search to find the effigy. But they found it and put it in there. So actually, in the effigy, they're both aged 42, although she died well into her 80s. Now, she then decided maybe if she got him married, she'd sort him out. So they searched Europe for a suitable virginal princess. And they found Princess Alexandra in Denmark. And she decided that Bertie would marry Princess Alexandra. Alexandra's sister, just to show all the interconnection, her sister married the Tsar. So they were closely related. Bertie was the first cousin of the Tsar. And then, imagine this on your wedding day, she turned up in black for the wedding. And then afterwards she insisted on this photograph. There's Alex trying to look her best. Bertie saying, Christ, get me out of here, you know. And Victoria looking at a bust of Albert. And that's the official wedding book. So that's what you're dealing with there now. So Bertie just went on. Now Alex was of the kind, of course she knew what he was at, but she was of the kind, unlike Diana in later years, she just put up with it. That's the way it was. She had her children, she was well looked after, and she just now, as it turned out, within a few years, whatever kind, she got some kind of thing, and she became deaf. So it probably suited her to be deaf, you know. And she was Victoria was very attached to her. She couldn't stand Bertie. Victoria, Alexandra put up with Bertie. And you can see, there's Bertie now. And that was him now for the rest of his life. One mistress after another. If you want to read all about Nellie Clifton and so on, there's a new book out now, paperback, by royal appointment, and that's the story of Bertie and Nellie Clifton. They're published last year. Victoria got more and more grumpy. I mean, Albert was dead. Albert was the man. Albert handled everything herself. And here she is left, Christ, with 9 kids. And she's not an idea how to raise kids. She was an only child. Her father died in infancy. She was reared under the strictest of circumstances. She hadn't a bloody clue. And there she is at different stages over there. Her life, in her eyes, was destroyed. Her life ended when Albert died. She went into deep mourning. She didn't appear in public for 10 years. She wouldn't give Bertie anything to do. And it came very close to the collapse of the monarchy, because eventually Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister, said to her, people were beginning to feel they didn't need a monarchy, because she didn't appear. And she just had to start appearing. So she started appearing, but it was all under sufferance. And she wouldn't smile, and you could look at her and say, what she's thinking was, Christ, I don't want to be here. You know what I mean? And there she is in very late life with 4 generations. And this is David, who became the Duke of Windsor. And here we go again, with Mrs. Simpson and all the rest of it. And they got over him when George VI came in. And then 2 generations later, we have Charles and Camilla and Diana. So it seems to come every 2nd generation. But there's 4 monarchs there. That's the Queen's grandfather, and that's her uncle who married Mrs. Simpson. So Killarney was the last real enjoyment she had. She was asked many times, she never stopped speaking about it, and she was asked many times would she revisit it. And she said she would love to revisit, but she wouldn't because it was too painful. It was such a happy time for her and Albert, and she would be overcome with the emotion of it. So that's that, that's her out of the way. Now you come to the Herberts, Muckross House. They went to Muckross House and they stayed with the Herberts, and the Herberts spent a fortune on setting up the whole place. Colonel Henry Herbert, 1815 to 1866, he was the Chief Secretary of Ireland. Now, if you hosted the monarch, you would without doubt get a title. And it was such a success, he was assured that he would get an earldom after that. But Albert was dead within 14 weeks, so she withdrew from public life. She wouldn't attend the opening of Parliament, she wouldn't go to anything. And she didn't declare any new titles and so on. And for over 10 years, in the meantime, Colonel Herbert died, 1866, died relatively young man, 51. His wife had brought a dowry, she was Scottish, and she had brought a dowry of 40,000 to the marriage in 1837. A lot of noughts on 40,000, and it was from that they built the present Muckross House. They did live on the estate, but they built Muckross House. It was palatial. After he died, his son inherited the estate, and also there were MPs, the 2 of them, but he contracted Parkinson's disease, and he stayed in London, and he took lodgings with his doctor, and he died, and the estate went down and down and down. They're buried, the three. She went off, after his death, went off to live with her daughter in England. They're buried under a huge Celtic cross in Killarney Cemetery overlooking Muckross. Now there's your standard Celtic cross, see that? And that's about twice the height of this room. So look at that cross. Okay? It's probably the biggest Celtic cross in Ireland. And they're buried under that, and they're looking out over the estate. The estate became encumbered because they weren't managing it. This man wasn't managing it. And in 1898, the Standard Life Assurance Company took over the estate in lieu of outstanding debts. The estate was put up for sale, and there was a great fear that it would be broken up. Okay? But it was bought by Lord Ardelon. You know the man who sits on the thing in Stephen's Green where the Lewis stuff? Edward Arthur Guinness. He also owned Ashford Castle, he owned half of Connemara, he owned the Arden Islands, and his big house was in St. Anne's out there where the big park is now out in Clontarf, out there. Now, Colonel Herbert's sister married the Earl of Bantry, and they had a daughter, Olive, and she married Lord Ardelon. Just follow that connection. So when the estate, the mother was now dead, she's now Olive Lady Ardelon, and when the whole estate broke up, she inveigled Lord Ardelon, who was one of the richest men in Ireland, we can't let the estate go. So Lord Ardelon bought the estate, even though he had nothing, he didn't want, but to keep the wife as one does. If that keeps you happy, dear, you can have your estate. But he's no interest in the estate, okay? So, what he did with the estate was, he rented it out to very rich, mainly Americans, for shooting parties and so on. And the Bourne Vincents, William Bourne Vincent, a billionaire from California, no connection with Ireland, he used to bring his family over every year for 4 months in Killarney, in Muckross, and they loved it. And they loved doing the square thing and all the rest of it. They had one child, Maud, and the Guinnesses used to do the same with Lugalaw, remember? Lugalaw, they bought Lugalaw from our person. And there's the Bourne Vincents there, or the Bournes there. There's Maud, the older child. And Maud fell in love with Arthur Vincent. And Arthur was the son of a middle-ranking family from County Clare. He landed on the street anyway. So when Maud married Arthur Vincent, William Bowers Bourne bought Muckross Estate and gave it to them as a wedding present. And that's the kind of daddy dad. Just gave them the whole thing as a wedding present. Unfortunately, money doesn't solve all things. There's the Rose was the eldest, and they had Billy later. And the arrangement was they would alternate, that Rose and the children would go to California 1 year, and the mother and father would come the next year. And unfortunately, they all travelled first class and so on. They spent a fortune on the house. Unfortunately, in 1926, on her way to the father and mother in California, she died of pneumonia, with the 2 children with her. So there's Maud dead, and Arthur, who is now left with Muckross and all the rest of it, and he was a diplomat and so on. He went to the father-in-law in 1932 and said, look, I just can't, my heart isn't in this estate, and so on. Now at that stage, a lot of the estate, originally 47,000 acres, but a lot of it had been sold off to the tenants, but they still had the house and 11,000 acres. So he put it to the father that the house and the estate would be given to the Irish nation as a memorial to Maud. And they did that. And for many years it was known as the Bourne Vincent Memorial Park. It wasn't, you know, generosity and so on. Now there they are through their life. There's the Bourne Vincent, there's Maud and Arthur. They lived in a big house called Philoli, and that comes from the first 2 letters of the family motto: fight for a just cause, love your fellow man, and live a good life, Philoli. And that's a huge mansion in the estate, and when he and the wife died, Maud was dead at this stage, they left the whole thing to the equivalent of the American Heritage Trust. And when I gave this talk some weeks ago, a woman came up and she said, "You just answered one thing for me." I said, "What's that?" I said, "I was visiting my daughter in California, and nearby we went to see this Filoli house. We knew nothing about the history, just because of it. And she said the house was full of paintings of Killarney. And I couldn't understand what the hell all these paintings." And she said, "That's the answer to it." There's Maud with Rose. Rose died in 1983. Maud and Rose are buried in California with father and mother. There's Rosie, as she was known, and Billy, who was the son. There's the father. There's the house. Billy lived into his 90s and died in 2012. And Billy was a businessman and very rich man, of course, billionaire. He inherited the whole lot. He lived in Monaco, but he kept an apartment at Muckross, and he was very generous to sporting clubs and scouts and all kinds of things in Killarney. If you wanted a few quid, you got in touch with Billy in Killarney, with the result that when he died, see all the Guard of Honour here in Killarney Cemetery, and he died in Monaco, but his ashes were brought back because he asked to be buried beside the father in Killarney Cemetery. Now it's said of the father, Maud's husband, that he, on his instructions, wanted to be buried in Killarney Cemetery standing up so that he could look out over Killarney. Now whether they did that, I don't know, but Billy is buried beside him, age 93, in Monaco. And I mean, what generous people, you know. We have had we had them, and we later on have McShane, and then you have McElhenney up in Glenveigh and Donegal, and you have Chester Beatty. All these people, like, oh, there's nothing. And when you see some of the money grabbers we have of our own, Christ, much of them, you know. Anyway, we come to the Earls of Kenmare. So that ended up good thing being left, but great disaster despite all the money, the great tragedy. The Earls of Kenmare, you'll enjoy this. The Earls of Kenmare were one of the few Catholic families in the ascendancy. They were way up there. And the reason they remained Catholic was under the penal laws to break up the Catholic estates. When an Earl died or the Lord died, the land had to be divided between all the male heirs. That's how they succeeded in breaking it. And that didn't apply to a Protestant landowner. For 2 generations, however they did it, at a critical time when the penal laws were there, 2 generations of the Earls of Kenmare only produced 1 son. So they kept the land. How they did it in those days, nothing. And by the time it won't be long now, the penal laws were gone. You're looking at your watch, am I tight?
No, you're fine.
I'm okay, yeah. Now, there's the Kenmare house that Queen Victoria visited. The Duchess of, the Countess of Kenmare was, she was into social elevation. Christ, don't marry a woman who's into social elevation, because nothing was ever, you know. And she considered the house a bit of a kip, you see. So she said to Queen Victoria that they were going to build a proper house. And she went over to Queen Victoria, and herself and Queen Victoria picked the site for the proper house, this one. Okay? So they demolished that one after Queen Victoria, and they built this one. And then no sooner had it finished, when it went on fire and burned to the ground. Now these houses were prone to go on fire all the time. Do you see all those chimneys? Well, every room in the house had a fireplace, with the result that the flues, the chimneys, were like a map of the London Underground, running all through the house. And they were prone to going on fire, and something went up the chimney. Now, you didn't know where the bloody fire was. So they used to run around the house looking for a hot wall. You know, oh, so when they found a hot wall, they had to dig the wall out to try and get at the fire, with the result that these big houses were constantly going on fire. So no insurance, of course, all gone. And then they moved back to this site. That was Kenmare House. They called the new one Killarney House. And they went back to this site and they took all the outbuildings, the coach houses and so on, and they converted them into what they would call a modern house there. And they called that Kenmare House. And that's where they lived, and that's the house that's still there. There's the man who was Earl when Queen Victoria came. Unfortunately then, in 1920, the War of Independence, Glenna Cottage was burned to the ground. That cottage, the Queen Victoria. Can you imagine if it was there today, people visiting, burned to the ground, and that's what's there today, never rebuilt. Now you'll enjoy this. The 6th Earl of Kenmare, the grandson of the man who was there, Queen Victoria, Valentine. Now, if Edward VII was a lad, Valentine was a lad multiplied. And Valentine had no interest whatever in the estate, and Valentine just dining and wining and cigars. And he married Doris Delavine. Now there was a documentary on recently about Doris, because they were part of the Churchill set, the Riviera set, in the 1920s. They went to the Riviera and painted, and all kinds of shenanigans, and the Duke of Windsor and all this. And that Valentine took no interest whatever in the estate. And he said, I dissipated my patrimony, I committed many sins, I wasn't important. And he got bigger and bigger and bigger. They divorced eventually, and Doris committed suicide in a posh hotel in New York. The title was taken over briefly by a brother who wasn't married. They had no children, wasn't married, and he died from it. So now the title was gone. The estate was in rag order. I'll tell you the story about Valentine, tell you what he was like. He loved meeting dinner parties and so on. And the story is told he was at this very posh dinner party. He, as well as Earl of Kenmare, did a number of other titles. He was Viscount Castle Ross. Ross Castle, Ross Castle, that was their castle, Castle Ross. So he liked to be called the Castle Ross. He liked to be called the Castle Ross. And they were at this big dinner, and he was there taking up the equivalent of 2 chairs beside him, and he puffed a cigar, and this lady beside him said, by God, Castle Ross, she said, you're a disgrace. What would you say if a lady had that body on her? And he puffed on the cigar, and he said, I can assure you, madam, that no more than 12 hours ago, he said, a lady did have that body on her. And greatly pleased she was. So that's what you're dealing with. That's what you're dealing with there now. Anyway, so now they were Catholic in name, and their father, not the had paid huge amounts of money for the building of Killarney Cathedral. So they're all buried in the Kenmare Chapel in Killarney Cathedral. You go in there. There's the inscription that's on the vault, see it there? And they're all buried in there. And the vault is sealed now because it's all. Now, they had a sister, these pair had a sister, and she married into the Grosvenor family in London, richest family in England. Own all of central London, West End, and they're the ground landlords. And their sister married into the Grosvenor family, and that couple had a daughter, Beatrice. So the whole lot went to Beatrice. And Beatrice was a different kettle of fish. Beatrice was a businesswoman. During the war, she had been deputy commander-in-chief of the John's Ambulance Brigade, so she was into, So she came over and had one look at it and said, oh Christ, something has to be done about this. So she put the whole lot up for sale, and it was bought by an American, John McShane, who was the son of Irish immigrants. He's known as the builder of Washington. He built all the Smithsonian museums and all. He totally refurbished another billionaire. Beatrice sold the main part of the estate, John McShane. She kept a couple of 100 acres on the site of the old Killarney house, the one that burned down. and she had a nice little house built for herself. There you are now, just settled for that.
Nice.
And Knockrear House, designed by her cousin, and there she lived for the rest of her life. And on her death, she handed a whole lot over to the Irish people there. Now we come to McShane's. They have bought the whole estate. McShane is the son of an Irish emigrant, penniless, and they bought the house and they refurbished the whole house and gardens and so on. They were a very Catholic couple, and their only child, Pauline, became a nun. There's Pauline there, and the mother in Killarney, and there's Pauline in later years. And Pauline joined an American religious order, and she rose to become the Mother General of the whole thing, and by all accounts a very nice person. Pauline came back in 2010, and she hadn't been home. Her mother and father died back in the 90s. She hadn't been home since the whole lot. McShane left all the estate to the nation to become part of a national park. The house would pass to the nation when either himself or his wife were the last to die. So he died in 1989 and she died in 1993, I think. And then the house and all the contents passed to the state. Pauline was mainly in Africa, and then she became the Mother General, and then she came over to be given, the Irish hierarchy decided to give her an award for her work as a missionary sister. She came over and she said, sure, I'll pop around and see the old gap, and there's what she found. That when the state took over the house, they removed all of the contents and they let the house deteriorate, and it was full of junkies and winos and so on. And she had a stroke. And she marched into the office of the Minister for Heritage and Culture, who was then John Gormley, remember the green man? And by all accounts, she reduced him to a quivering wreck. What she didn't say to him. And she got an undertaking from him that it would be sorted out. And there just last year, it reopened after an expenditure of £7.5 million. They got it in mint condition now, and it got worse because all the contents, when they took over from the Kenmares and Beatrice, they also bought all the contents, and the OPW put all the contents into secure storage. And in 2010, there was an auction in Bonhams, big London place, and just by chance there happened to be an Irish art historian there. And two of the pictures that were for sale, he said to himself, they're part of the Kenmare collection, and they are in state custody. So he went to Bonhams, and then they went to the government, and so on, and it transpired that the storage place where they were, some of the lads in there, they'd all this stuff. The OPW had these huge stores. When they were short a few quid, they'd go and find some obscure things and send them to Bonhams or send them to wherever for sale. And when an audit was done, £500,000 worth of stuff was missing. Now, I searched all the papers. I couldn't find out what happened to the two lads. Given it was the Irish Public Service, it's unlikely they were sacked. The Irish Public Service has this other category, cul-de-sac. You know, you just show to, like for example, in the main, Irish ministers, take the Minister of Health, they don't resign. English ministers resign to drop the hat. Irish ministers don't do resignation. You know. So anyway, that's the story of Killarney House and what happened there. But we were the beneficiaries in the end, because the whole lot came back. They put it all together. Beatrice Grosvenor's, the McShanes, the Muckra's house, and some land they had themselves, and turned it all into the Killarney National Park. And today, there's the perimeter of it there. Okay, and it's 30,000 acres. And it's the premier tourist venue there. Absolutely magnificent. There's the restored house there, and there's Muckra's house, and the boat trip is one of the big attractions today. Kate Carney's cottage and all the rest of it there. And I took 2017, the population of 14,500 with 10,000 visitor beds in a town of that size, 1.1 million visitors, direct hospitality jobs, 5,000, although you would add in coaches and meat suppliers and everything else, and the total tourist spending 410 million. So at the end of it all, a success story. Then you think it's all over, and then last year, who pops in? Only Charlie and the missus. Okay? And there he is in Muckle's house, being shown mementos. And she shows you how you must hear all these things in the royal family and so on. She requested a pony and trap trip to Muckle's Abbey. Remember, they remembered all that way. And there she is in the pony and trap, heading off down to Muckle's Abbey. But there's a little story for you now. Thank you very much.